Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Taraf, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay. So we're starting a new chapter. Small chapter. So it says here like this. In the Tur, כדרה שיש בה אוכלים, מותר לחלוב בהמה לתוכה, להריף, ואף על פי שאסור להיינק מן הבהמה ביום טוב, אלא אם כן היה מצטער. אם לא ינק אפילו הכי, מותר לחלוב לתוך הקדרה. So what is we talking about here? We're talking about milking the animal, right? So says over here the Tur that according to the Rif, you're allowed to milk the animal on Yom Tov if you're dripping the milk into food. And it says even though, right, you're not allowed to you're not allowed to milk an animal on Yom Tov, unless it had some right discomfort because the udders are full. Im lo yinak, if it wouldn't listeners. So he says, but nevertheless, right, it is allowed to milk into a dish, right? But if there's no food in the dish, right, just empty, asur, then it's forbidden, right, according to the Rif. The Rach forbids this even when there is food in there. So we have two different opinions, right, going on. So that's what the Torah says, right? That's the whole chapter there. So let's see the Bet Yosef. So says Bet Yosef, he brings the source for this, right? Perek Chavit, it's over there in Shabbat. Kuf Mem Dal Amud Bet. Amar Rav Yehuda, right? Omer Shemuel, Sochet Adam Eshkol Shel Anavim Letoch HaKdera, Aval Lo Letoch HaKe'ara. Right? Okay, so what are we saying over here, right? We're talking about even Shabbat. That what? That a person is allowed to squeeze grapes, right, into a dish. So what does that mean? He's squeezing the grapes in there, obviously not to drink right from there. He's squeezing it in order to flavor the dish, right? Whatever, to give some flavor there. Okay, so that's okay. Right? Even on Shabbat. But he says you can put it into a dish, but not put it into a tray, right? So we'll see what that means. Says the Rif, Perush hakdera yesh ba ochel. So says the Rif, explains. What does that mean? The dish has food in there. So therefore, it's considered to be, like abba leochel. So it's considered to be like a liquid that comes into a food, right? So therefore, it's considered to be like the food itself. And this is the reason why you're allowed to do it on Shabbat, right? So says the Rif, right? But the tray doesn't have any food inside; it's empty, right? Therefore, it's forbidden because you're not putting it into the food. So what are you doing? You're just basically squeezing out the juice, right? Which is forbidden, right? That's the thing. So yeah, so it says regarding that in the Gemara, Amar Rav Chazda, מדברי רבנו נלמוד חולב אדם עז לתוך הקדרה. So he says, right, that we learn from the rabbi that a person is allowed to milk the goat into the dish, right? Same thing. In other words, milking an animal is the same prohibition as squeezing the grapes. Same thing. We call that in Hebrew, right? Mefarek. What does that mean, mefarek? He is squeezing out something from a certain source, right? And making it separate, separating it from its source. That's called mefarek. So it's the same thing whether you're milking or you're juicing, right? The grapes, making grape juice or wine, whatever it is that you're doing there. The same idea. But when you're putting it into a dish, as we said, it's allowed. So the same thing also applies to the goat's milk as well. That's the thing, right? Okay. So then he goes on. So there he says, the Rip says there is an opinion that this teaching of Shmuel is talking about Yom Tov only, right? Not Shabbat. But there is another opinion that says that no, really, this teaching is talking about Shabbat, right? So, right, obviously, if it's allowed on Shabbat, it's also allowed on Yom Tov as well. So says the Rif, right? That's the more plausible opinion here, that we're talking about Shabbat and all the more so Yom Tov, right? Right? So he says that's how Rabbeinu Hananel explained this. But Rabbeinu Hananel says, right, that these words of Shmuel, they're not halakha. We don't paskin like that. That's what he says, right? So he says, you know what? We looked into this opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel, right? But we found, right, that there's some questions, some issues with this, right? It's not so clear cut what he's saying. So he says, really, the halakha is like Shmuel, right? That a person is allowed to squeeze out, right, cluster of grapes, shel anavim, letoch hakdera, is put into the dish. Right, halacha nami kerab chazda. So it says therefore halacha is also Rab chazda. Teka yalif mineh. Right, so he learns from there the cholev adam ez beyom tov, that you're allowed to. He learns from there Rab chazda. You're also allowed to milk the animal, as we said, right, on Yom Tov, letoch hakdera, into the pot, into the dish, right. Aval lo letoch hakdera, but not into an empty tray. That we don't allow. The Hai Gaon, the Psikna, right. So he says Rabbi Hai Gaon also paskins like that. What does that mean? He's lenient, right? Not like Rabbeinu Hananel, who's stringent regarding this. So he says, in my mind, the Rip says there's no doubt about this, right? In other words, it's clear. Right? So it's that which we say in Yevamot, in Perek Keresh, Kuf Yudal Amud Aleph, Shasur linak mina behema b'yom tov, that you're not allowed to, right, you're not allowed to nurse from the animal on Yom Tov, right? In other words, like to go to the udder, and just like, suck it out, right? You're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Right? So he says, right, that, but when, if you have some discomfort, you're allowed to, right? So let's say, right, what would be discomfort? Let's say, a person has like a cough, right? He's coughing. So, he needs some milk to, what do you call it? To help him in the throat, right? So that helps him, right? It calms his throat a little bit. So that's allowed. Right, so it says חמור הוא מן החולב לתוך הקדרה, ואף על פי שהוא מפרק כלאחר יד, שהיונק, so he says, but that's more stringent than the issue of, squeezing into food, right? That's more lenient. So you can't learn one from the other, right? It's not the same thing at all. That's what he's saying, right? ואף על פי שהוא מפרק כלאחר יד, so he says, even though that, right, he is doing right in an abnormal manner, because it's not the way, right, to suck out from an animal, to nurse from an animal, right? Not exactly the regular way. שהיונק בפיו כסוחט משקהו והחולב לתוך הקדרה כמברר אוכל הוא, לפיכך מותר. So it says, right, but so therefore, right, if you're milking, right, as we said, into the dish, it's allowed. That's not a problem. Why is that? Because it's like, you're just, you're making it into food. So therefore it's allowed. Okay, so right, that's the story there. That's the opinion of the Rif. So it says, right, that which we allow, to nurse, because a person has, discomfort, as we said, right? So it says, even if he's, just hungry, and, because he's like, he has hunger pangs, right? Even for that, he's allowed to nurse from the animal. B'yom tov, on Yom Tov. כתב הר"ן, says the Ran, דהיינו תמה דשארי לשחוט אשכול של ענבים. So says the Ran that the reason that it's allowed to squeeze out, right, a cluster of grapes לתוך הקדרה into the dish בשבת on Shabbat, ואסור לחלוב עז, but you're not allowed to, right, as we said, to milk the animal. הקדרה משום דאשכול גופה ראוי לאכילה. One second. Yeah. So as we said, right, that you're not allowed to milk the goat into the dish, right? That's according to Rabbeinu Hananel, apparently, because the Rif does allow that. But anyway, right, it says, right, the difference is because the cluster of grapes itself, rawi lachila, it's fitting to eat like that, as is. So it's like food. Right, but not when it comes to goat. The lachazia b'Shabbat, it's not fitting on Shabbat. Why? Because you have to eat it, you have to slaughter it, right? Then you can't do that on Shabbat. So it says, therefore, if you allow to milk inside the dish, right? Granted, right, that milk, right, once it comes into the food, it's like food. But it's considered to be like you're sifting something, right? Separation. You're separating. Right? You're separating food from, right, refuse, right? B'yom tov the ez gufeh chazia lachila. So it says, therefore, only on Yom Tov, right, where the there, right, the goat is fitting to eat because you can slaughter it on Yom Tov. Aval Shabbat, the lo chazia lachila. But it says when it comes to Shabbat, since it's not fitting, right, to eat that on Shabbat, not so, right? We don't allow that. So it says in the first perek of Betzah, where is that? Aleph Amud Aleph. That which Rav Chasda said, right, that you're allowed to milk the goat into the dish. We're talking about a goat which is, designated for eating, right? That's interesting. That's like food, right? The afrat who, right? The afrat im ena omedet lachila. But if it's not designated for eating, not so, right? We don't allow that, he says. Like we said in Gemara Bet Amud Aleph, if you're talking about a chicken which is made for laying eggs, right, designated for that purpose, my tama the Bet Shemai, then what's the purpose of Bet Shemai? Right? Muksehu, it's mukse. So even though in the Perek Chabit says Katav, it says over there, בשם הרמב"ן, the name of the Ramban, שאין מוקצה מחמת איסור הבא מעצמו, כגון זה. So he says that there is no muksa because of prohibition that comes by itself like this, the lo dachia biadayim, because he didn't push it out but with his hands, actively push it out from usage. ולא עבר עליו אפילו בשוגג. So he says he didn't transgress there, right, upon it, even inadvertently. Because once the prohibition is removed, muktzeh is also removed. So therefore, says the Ramban, it's allowed. Hi, chalav, that the milk that came into the right, that was milked into the dish. Even though, right, that the goat was muktzeh, but he says that milk right, that was milked into the right into the dish. The designation of muktzeh has already been removed there. So there's no prohibition there, right? There was no prohibition there. So therefore, we're not really concerned about the prohibition of muktzeh. Right? Adkan, that's the end of it. Okay. So that's the words of the the Ran. Okay, the Ran, yes. Okay, good. So that's the words of the Ran. So he already wrote, right? He says that in the first parak of Betzah, that way, that which Katab Sham, that he read over there, we're talking about that the goat, right? It's for eating purposes, designated. Askinan, who ikar? So he said that's halacha. That's what the Smag said. The Samak, and also the Samak, Bilchot Shabbat, right? In laws of Shabbat. So in other words, they all agree. These rabbis, when we allow this to milk this goat, right? We're talking about a goat which is designated for eating. Askinan. Interesting. Okay. That's what it says also the Asheri, the goat of the Asheri. Beresh Betzah, right? In the beginning of Betzah. Siman Aleph. Chalav shenechelab b'yom tov. So it says milk which was milked for Yom Tov. Afilu mimela, right? Even by itself. Asur b'yom tov. Not allowed. In other words, even if it came out by itself, you didn't squeeze it. It's still forbidden. Yom Tov. Lo shana nechalav letoch hagdera. Whether doesn't matter whether it's right into the pot, into the dish, but lo shana letoch hakera or tray, right? So yeah, this one is stringent, right? This opinion. Meshum nolad, right? Because of the prohibition of nolad, right? Which is making something new. V'chen im nechalav b'Shabbat hasamuch liyom tov. Says also if it was milked on Shabbat, which is before Yom Tov, asur b'Yom Tov, it's forbidden on Yom Tov. Mishum hachana, because of preparation, right? Okay, preparation. So there, right, he's talking about what? That he's milking the goat into the dish, right? So he says again, right, same thing. He's telling you, right, we're talking about an animal which is not made from milking, not designated for milking, it's designated for eating. You're gonna slaughter it and have it, for dinner one day, right? That's what it's talking about. Okay. If he wants, he can slaughter it. And that's the reason why we allow it, because he can slaughter it. So why is that important? Because it's food, so there's no prohibition there of muktzeh. Right? Therefore, it's not something new. So it says, nevertheless, right, inside the dish, it's forbidden, mishum nolad, because of right nolad. The mekara ochel behashta mashke, because before it was food, and now it's right, it's drink, right? It's a liquid. So we have here several opinions, right? They're not all the same, right? There's different nuances going on here. So says the Kolba, right? There are those who are stringent about this. If the goat is for milking, right? So why is that? Because since the goat is muktzeh, also the milk is muktzeh. Some say just the opposite, right? That even if it's for milking, right, it's not the milk is not muktzeh. Right? Unless you're right, if it's not made for making cheese. The schorat dumya, right, for merchandise. Dumya the tarnagolet right, just like a chicken which is designated for growing eggs, right? Gadel efrochim, or chicks. V'chen dat Raza. That's what it says in Raza. Adkan. That's the end of it. Okay, goes on. Katuv be'agaot ashiri. It says in agaot ashiri. Basop per kama de betzah. in the end of the first parak of Betzah. Im cholev goy ve'Yisrael roeu. So it says, if the goy is milking it, and the Jew is watching, right? He's a mashgiach, right? Whatever, right? Ve'viol Yisrael doron, and then they brought gifts to the Jew b'Yom Tov and Yom Tov. Rishon, on the first day of Yom Tov, B'Sheni Yamim Tovim Shel Galuyot. We're talking about the 2 days of Yom Tov in diaspora. Mutar le'arev kibetzah. So it says you can mix it up like an egg, he says. How can I see the end of it? So it seems from his words, he says, the bo bayom asur, that on the same day it's forbidden. Aval Rashba katab b'tshuva, but the Rashba says in the tshuva, ma she'amart begoy acholev b'yom tov shechaliot achar Shabbat. That's what you said, right? That the goy who's milking on Yom Tov that falls on Shabbat, right? It falls after Shabbat. Bifnei Yisrael, in front of the Jew, if shar shehu mutar, it's possible that it's allowed to eat. Kedin amrat chalab eno muktzeh. So you say, right, that the chalab, the milk is not muktzeh. Sharei mukhan because it's ready to go. Right, it's designated. Shafilu Yisrael if shar shehu mutar lechalov oto tocha kedera. Because it says, right, that it's possible that even a Jew can put it into the dish, right, and milk it in there. Sheyesh bo ochel, that has food there. So, right, we see that the Rashba here is more lenient here, right? Definitely than what we saw before. Azil, right, goes according to his reading. It says, so it says Rashba in this parak, so it says the Ramban is halakha, right? And we already saw the Ramban was lenient as well. And so the Rashba goes in the same way as the Ramban. So, okay, right, so we saw here, right, about 3 or 4 different opinions going on here, right? So let's see what we got in the end, right? What's going on? Bottom line. So says the Bet Yosef like this, right? Since this is a rabbinical issue, right? This whole thing, so therefore he says we go lenient here. Right? That's the whole thing. Okay. By the way, why is this rabbinical? What's the reason why? Any of you understand why that is? This is not from the Torah, this prohibition. Because when you're squeezing it into a dish, right, it's not really the prohibition of milking, or whatever, right? Juicing. It's, because you're making it into food. So according to the Torah, there's no problem. You know what I mean? So therefore, the only problem is, as we said, right, it's not designated, right? It's nolad, it's something new, all these kinds of things. These are all rabbinical prohibitions. They're not from the Torah. Right? So therefore, it says Bet Yosef, since the prohibition is really from the Torah here, so therefore we go like the lenient opinion. So what does that mean? We go like the Rif, right, who allows you to milk, right, the animal, right, into a dish. Same thing as a cluster of grapes, right, which we allow. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. So says this mag, the laws of Shabbat, right, that the person can, right, milk, as we said, right, the goat into the dish, but not into the, as we said, right, not into the tray, which is empty. But he says if there are crumbs in that dish, in that, right, in the tray, right, shapirdam, it's allowed. Why? Because those crumbs are like food, so it's like a dish. But the dafka b'yom tov, right? That's only yom tov, he says. And also has to be, right, that the goat is, for eating, right, not designated for milking. That would mean that he could slaughter on yom tov. So he's a little bit more stringent here, right? This rabbi, right? But the Samak says, "Cholev adam ez b'yom tov l'toch hagedera, aval lo l'toch ha'keara, ve'itberak b'shula shapir dame, ve'yesh somchim la'asot ken כשמשימים פירורים בקערה לחלוב עליו ביום טוב, אבל אין רוח חכמים נוחה ממנו, right? So this rabbi says that even though some people allow that trick, right, to milk it into the crumbs, right, because this way it's like you're putting it into food, but he says the rabbis don't like this. It's like sort of like a, you're kind of like going around, right, cheating a little bit, right here, right, a little bit, fraudulent a little bit, right, whatever. But it says if the goy did, it's allowed. I said then the Jew can have the milk. Right, once, as long as the Jew saw, right, that it was being milked, when it was being milked. But it says to drink it is forbidden. This rabbi says, they brought the words of the Samag, with Divrei Samak, and the Samak. So he writes the words of the Samak like this. So here, right, he has a different version of the Samak, which is more lenient, right? That what? He allows you to do it into the crumbs. Because, it gets absorbed into the crumbs, the milk, and it becomes food. Okay, נעשה אוכל, והווה משקה הבא לאוכל, אך מכל מקום יש אין רוח חכמים נוחה ממנו. But he says the rabbis don't like this though, whatever, as we said, right? They don't like it. אבל it's like kind of like, manipulation, whatever you want to call it, right? אבל על חתיכת פת שאין החלב מתערב עמו, זה אסר רבנו יחיל. But he says, putting into a piece of bread, like that, this rabbi forbids, right? So it's worse than the crumbs, right? Why is that? So he says because the bread doesn't really absorb the milk, right? Like the crumbs do. So therefore, it doesn't really become food. It stays like liquid. But he says if the goy did so, right, and the Jew was watching, it's allowed, right? The Jew can have it, right, to eat it. But to drink the milk is forbidden. He says, interesting. Okay, wow. So we have lots of opinions over here, right? No lack of opinions over here. Okay. כתב הריב"ש בתשובה, says the ריב"ש in the תשובה, פירש לתוך הקדרה שהוא מותר כשיש בה אוכל משום דמשקה הבא לאוכל כאוכל דמה. So he says, right, the reason we allow this, as we said, is because once the milk goes into the food, it becomes like food. We already said that, right, 10 times already. זהו כשבא לאוכל לתקנו, that's only when it's coming for the food, to do some kind of to make it good, right, to make it edible, to make it more delicious, and to improve it, whatever it is, right? Because then it looks like you're not interested in drinking it, you're not doing like trickery. Right? So it says in Rashi, says, אבל החולב כל צונו, right, the mashkin, לא הותר מפני פרוסה אחד שנתן בכלי. So it says, but if you want to milk, right, all your flock, right, so you can't allow it by putting, one piece of bread, right, in the tray, Right, that's right, cheating, right? Because that piece of bread obviously will, is too small to absorb all that milk, right? That you're putting a gallon of milk in there, you know what I mean? Or 5 gallons, one piece of bread is not going to help you, right? With that, and that's already like totally cheating, right? Totally dishonest. Okay, that's what he's saying, right? Okay. אם מותר לומר לגוי לחלוב בהמתו בשבת, נתבהר בסימן ש"ה, right? He says regarding asking a goy to milk your animal on Shabbat, it talks about it in chapter 305, right? Laws of Shabbat over there. אם מותר להעמיד חלב או לעשות גבינה ביום טוב. So now there's also another question, right? Are you allowed to, right, make cheese on Yom Tov, right? התבהר בסימן כ"ק י' בסייעתא דשמיא, right? It's going to be explained in that siman, right? In 411. I can't wait till we get there. Okay. כתב סמ"ג, בהלכות שבת, says the סמ"ג, והרבי יוסף התיר לדון shumin b'yom tov. So it says Rabbi Yosef allows to laduch shumin, right? To, as we said, right? To pound garlic on Yom Tov. L'kachat haboser, and then to take the liquid, right, that comes out of it, the juice, right? V'laduch v'lischot mashkin shel haboser al shumin. And then, right, what you do is on top of that garlic, right, you're gonna take, right, and put some liquids on top of it, right, to squeeze them out. So it's considered like you're putting it on food. The food is the garlic. Because that will be like a drink with liquid which comes into food, right? Because just like when we talked about the issue of squeezing the cluster of grapes, which is coming to the food, it's a dish. But Rabbi Yaakov doesn't like this. It doesn't allow that. So we have a machloket between Rabbi Yosef, right, and Rabbi Yaakov. Okay, there you go. All right, so I think we're talking about the Balei Tosfot, right? These are rabbis from Tosfot, these rabbis. Okay, anyway, right? So it goes on. The Dafka Nakat Eshkol Shel Anavim, Shanavim Ra'uim Lachila. So that's, he's talking about, specifically, right? A cluster of grapes. Why? Because they're fitting to eat. But boser, when it comes to, right, what do you call it? We're talking about grapes which are, unripe, right? Still very young, very small. Eno Ra'ui Lachila. That's not fitting to eat. Kiotan sheochlin betale datan betla datan. It says because the ones who eat it, right, they're like a minority, so we don't really consider that to be like the way of the thing. So therefore it's considered to be like you're picking out food from, right, the waste product, which is, you're sifting, right? Adkan, that's the end of it. The samak lo hevi ela divrei Rabbeinu Tam. But it's the samak only brought Rabbeinu Tam, the asar, that he forbade this. Ukvar nitbaer siman zeh besiman shinchet. It was already explained, it says, in the chapter 320, right, which is talking about Shabbat. V'sham nitbaer in mutar lischot limonish, right? Also over there, right, it says, we also talk about the issue of squeezing lemons, right? So when it comes to squeezing lemons, right? The rule is that the Sfardim are lenient about this. The Bet Yosef brings leniency there, but the Ashkenazim are stringent about squeezing lemons because of the right. That's the way their rabbis go. So they're a little bit stringent about that. So therefore, right, the Ashkenazi, when it comes to lemon, he'll only allow to squeeze it into food, right? Like we said, right? Squeezing it into food becomes like a food. But we allow even squeezing it into not food, right? Just squeezing it into, making some lemonade, right? We even allow that. So if I'm not mistaken, the Mishnah Berurah says there, if you want to make lemonade, right? So how do you do it, right? The Ashkenazi way. So what you do is you squeeze the lemon into the sugar, right? So this way, like you're squeezing it into food. And then you can make lemonade like that. Okay, but the Sfardim don't require that. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch and we're done. Have to bring this up probably, right? This is a new chapter. Yeah. Tough coupe, okay. Tough coupe. Let's bring it up. Okay, here we go. Here's the Shulchan Aruch. Oh, here we go. Right? So, as we said, if the animal is designated for eating, right? In other words, you're going to slaughter it one day, right? One day you will slaughter that animal, have it for dinner. Right? So now he wants to milk it, right? Before, right? To get the milk out of there. So it says, right, that if you're putting it into a dish, right, which has no food, forbidden, right? So, nobody allows that when there's no food there. So what do you really want here, right? He says the Shulchan Aruch, right? Your intention is to, you want to have the milk, right? To, eat it, whatever, right? In other words, it's not coming for drinking because, you're squeezing it into food. That's the whole thing, right? But if there's food in that dish, then it's allowed. Right? And for instance, right, how would that be? Right, that you're putting the milk in there in order to give flavor to the food, right? To flavor it, whatever it is, right? To enhance it. That's your purpose, right? If that's the case, it's allowed. Or sheyesh ba perurin, right? Or he says, right, also the trick with the crumbs, right? If you have crumbs there, and the milk will be absorbed into the crumbs, right? So it's got to be, not too much milk, as we said, right? If you put too much milk, it's not going to get absorbed into, a bunch of crumbs, gallon of milk, you know what I mean? So that's way too much. So it has to be, something, proportional, that it should, that it should get absorbed into the crumbs. That's the thing, right? אבל החולב כל צונו לא הותר מפני פרוסה שנותן בכלי. As we said, right? He's telling you, right? But don't go overboard with this, you know what I mean? Don't put gallons of milk, into one piece of bread. How is that going to happen, right? It's going to absorb a gallon of milk? How's that going to be, right? So that's not going to work. So you can't do that. Okay, good. So here says the Ramah, right? So he says, right, it brings the tshuva of the Rashba. I think we saw this already. That he says, right, that if the goy is milking the animal on Yom Tov, right, and the Jew is watching him, right, because otherwise there will be a problem with that's right, the milk of goy, right, milk of a goy. So that's not allowed. So therefore, you have to have supervision, right? So the Jew is watching him as he milks, right? So he says we can be lenient with that, to use that. But then he says like this, right? But he says the custom is to be stringent, right? Nevertheless, right? So first he waved it right for to entice you, and then he tells you no, not allowed. Custom is to be stringent, right? So that's what the Ramah is saying over here, right? It's allowed, but the custom is to be stringent, right? For the Ashkenazim at least, right? So there you go, right? Ashkenazim are stringent about that. Okay, that's clear. So he says, then b'yom tov shel galuyot mutar b'yom tov sheni. But it says Ramah, right, on the second day of Yom Tov we can allow that. Why is that? Because the second day is only from the rabbis, right? So we're more lenient, as we said, right? So second day of Yom Tov, there's no custom to be stringent, right? Even for the Ashkenazim. Okay. ואם מותר לומר לאינו יהודי לחלו בהמה טוב בשבת, דהיינו לאל סימן ש"ה, סעיף כ', דהיינו לאל סימן תק"ה י', סעיף ה', אם מותר להעמיד חלב לעשות גבינה ביום טוב, right? So he says, look in the other chapters, as we already mentioned, right? If you want to know, are you allowed to ask a goy to milk an animal for you, right? On Shabbat, right? That's one thing. And also the other thing is to make cheese, right? Are you allowed to make cheese on Yom Tov? We're going to see that later on, B'ezrat Hashem. If I remember correctly, right, you're not allowed to make cheese on Yom Tov. But we'll get to that. Okay, so anyway, right, we'll stop here. B'ezrat Hashem. We'll finish the chapter. So thanks for coming. God bless you. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm here. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. So okay, so we'll see you tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem. So yeah, Chag Sameach, right? Today was a Chag. Okay, we're finished with the Chag. Pesach Sheni. Okay, so B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow. Chazak u'baruch, Laila Tov.
Shabbat Harav, thank you so much.
All the best. God bless.
Thank you.